There is one more kind of light source that's recognized by Cycles, and it's referred to as the world, which is accessible in the World tab over here in the Properties panel, identified by this Earth icon. So we'll click on that, and by default, if we jump into Rendered Viewport Shading, and you can see that even though we have 0 lamp objects in the scene, we're still getting some kind of illumination enough to make out our objects. It's not pitch black, in other words. And this comes from the fact that our world by default is set to this dark gray color. So if we change that to black, now we have 0 illumination. And so what the world is it's like an infinite sphere that surrounds our Blender scene. And by infinite, I mean that it doesn't matter how big our objects are, or how far away our camera is from the objects, we never reach the limit of this world sphere. And so this can be very useful to supply our scene with general ambient illumination. As you can see here, we have a white color that is flooding our scene. And so in addition to a solid color value, we can also plug in image textures here. Now notice that we have this Use Nodes button, which means that the world is not entirely converted from being a Blender render world. So for example, if we were in the Blender render engine, we can also create a world. And then if we jump over to Cycles, we need to click this button to fully convert it into a Cycles world. So we'll click that, and we get this interface that should be familiar to you, the surface dropdown, where we can select our shader type. By default for the world, it's set to background, which is what we want. And below that we have color, but we can plug in a texture if we click this button on the right. So I'll click that and choose environment texture. And right away we get this ugly hot pink color, which is Blender's way to tell you that, hey, there's an image texture that I'm not able to source correctly. So we need to choose now the image file. I'll click the open button and navigate to my personal environment directory, which if we enable thumbnails, you can see are a specific type of image, kind of like a panorama, but it's actually called equirectangular mapping. And so if you simply type equirectangular into a search engine, you'll get these types of images. I'm just going to select corporate interior. And now our scene is illuminated by the values that come from this image texture. So in the illumination, we have some of this orangish yellow color. We get some of the green from the plant, but the majority is this whitish gray color from the building materials like concrete and marble tile, which all gets blended together to illuminate our scene. However, you can tell that the lighting is not particularly distinguished like it is if I were to add in here a lamp, area lamp, for example. As you can see, we get definitive shadows with an area lamp. However, just using the image texture, if I delete our lamp, we get some basic shadowing, but it's not enough to be appealing. It's just more general ambient illumination. And so we can change the strength over here. Let's bump that up to 2, and it will contribute more light into the scene. But in addition to ambient illumination, the world also provides something to be reflected. Whereas if you remember before, I'll just remove our environment texture, change that back to an RGB value. Our object is reflecting the world, but it only has a solid white color to reflect. And so it looks kind of odd if we're going for realism, because when in reality are we ever entirely surrounded by white? It's not very often. In my personal life, I've never been in that situation. And so it's easy to take for granted in reality that we have buildings and trees and grass and people and cars, all of this world that gets reflected. And then in computer graphics, we would have to build all of that from scratch. And so what the world environment does is provide the environment for realistic reflections. And so when we take an environment map and combine it with lamps, let me just try and undo till I get back to that area lamp. There it was. Using both lamps and the world together is a step in the right direction towards a much more believable lighting setup.